Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saud Al-Mashari. I'm a Premier Field Engineer with Microsoft Services. For those of you who don't know what a PFE is, we don't sit inside of the product team. We're inside of Microsoft Services and in the support organization. PFEs regularly go on site with customers and support customers. So the stuff I'm going to talk to you today is based on experience with customers. It's based on real world stuff. When I set out to write this session, there's a couple of different ways of looking at this. I could have come up here and given you a bunch of reports, and we could have gone through 10 different reports, and you would have seen 10 different reports. You might have found one or two that you like, and you might have said, well, yeah, that was great because I got one report. But to be fair, I could have just easily have saved you the trouble and put it up on a blog and you would have got it anyway. All right? So instead, I'm going to try and start at a 200 level. For those of you who are just looking at Config Manager, looking at 2012, we're going to do a refresher, and then we're going to dive into the meat of the presentation at about 300 level. And hopefully there'll be a couple of geeky 400 level bits that you don't, it'll be new, hopefully. So with that, we've got a refresher, we've got what's new with SP1. We'll then look at report security in SP1 because that's something that my customers had questions about, was how does report security work in SP1, especially some of the RBA functions. And then we're going to talk about reporting options outside of SSRS. So I'm going to actually avoid using SSRS. And I wanted to set that expectation up front. I'm going to show you T-SQL, but most of what I'm going to do today is going to be in Management Studio. And I'm going to show you a couple of other ways outside of SSRS to do work. And the reason for that, to me, SSRS is a presentation layer thing. Once you get your T-SQL solid, and you get the construct of what you want to report on, then you can dump it into SSRS. So, the refresher. So this is my joins cheat sheet. Right? Everyone should be familiar with that. Okay, you might even consider this 100 level information for a reporting session. But some people still don't know that. Maybe you're coming from another product. You're not coming from Config Manager. Resource IDs are the way that you join two tables together, two views, in fact. Either for computers, users, or devices. Assignment IDs. Those are for deployments of software updates, applications, and DCM. Largely, when you see deployment in the console, it really means an assignment as far as Config Manager is concerned. On the inside, it's all assignments, but in the console, deployment sounded better, so we called them deployments. CI IDs. We'll talk about this a little later on, but a CI is a configuration item. Everything in Config Manager for applications, software updates, DCM, and drivers are CIs. All right? Everything is a CI for those object types. Content IDs trace back our CIs. So when you look at an update or a driver in Config Manager, it has associated content with it that maps it to a package. And the content ID is what does that mapping between a CI and a package. Advertisement ID, another old school one. Anyone that's played with SMS should know that. Programs and task sequences use advertisements. Yes, the console calls it a deployment, but under the covers, it's still an advertisement. And last, but certainly not least, the collection ID. Yeah, collections. Package ID, as the name implies, is packages. The other thing to note there, DTs also use package IDs. So a DT is a CI, A CI has a content ID has an associated package. So I'm going to run through a couple of diagrams here. The diagrams are really in there for reference. I'm going to show some more stuff when we go back into Management Studio. They're there as quick references to some common scenarios. So if anyone's wondering why I'm using V collection members instead of full collection membership, I was having a chat with MSIT this week, and they said don't use V full collection membership. We cracked open the two SQL statements that form those views, and V collection membership is much, much cleaner. So yes, V collection membership probably has a little less information and so on. But if you've got a large environment and you need to do quick queries against collection membership, that's probably a better option. Again, this is our example. The other ones will form like this. So the joins are in blue, associated views that you join from. So in this case, we're going from computers in VR system, and we're going out to service, operating system, disk, and any other hardware inventory table that we have. The cool thing is, take a look at group map there. Group map will tell you all of the hardware inventory views and what's the associated history view if it exists. So instead of trying to hunt and peck for an HS view and you're not sure if it exists, group map will tell you if it's there or not. So in this case, we're looking at software updates. We start off with our compliance status and summary views. Those then join using CIID into the following additional information. So if you look at update compliance, it doesn't really tell you much, right? If I was to crack open update compliance, and we'll do that in the demo, you'll just see a table with a bunch of CIIDs and numbers counting the number of installed instances of that CIID. Well, that's not really that interesting. So in that case, you'd want to join to V update info, right? And if you join to V update info, that's where you get the user-facing information. Wherever possible, use the summary views. There are live views, but you're better off using the summary views because the summary views aren't updated as frequently as the other views, right? There's a summarization process that kicks off and updates them. So if you're writing something that's going to be polling a lot, let's say you're writing something in Orchestrator, and you're calling out from Orchestrator and checking something around the compliance of an update, right? But you're going to be doing that at scale. Yes, you might want the live information, but if you're willing to wait 15 minutes and allow summarization to occur, then use the summarization view instead. But it's a determination that you need to make. Do you need that live, or do you need it to scale to a higher level? And maybe using the summary views in that case. And a little geeky fun fact for you, software updates are called auth lists because that lists go back to the update lists in 2007. Software update groups are just an implementation of an update list. But they look like a new feature in the console. But in reality, you have auth list info. That is your software update group. So it's an example of a view that looks nothing like the console's name for the object. Again, here we're joining on CIID, and you join out to the live status. Content updates. Now this one's a long diagram. So we start with update info. Update info goes to CIID. We then go to update contents. Off of update contents, we get that content ID I talked about earlier. Then we get vContent, and then vContent gives us package ID. And package ID gives us back vPackage. So you can actually trace that back to the package that under the covers is moving that deployment type for you. So we're going to look at application deployments. There's two ways you could be joining them, either on CI ID to get more information about the application, or on assignment ID. So in this case, I've gone back to one of the major views, V configuration items, and that's giving me all the CIs in my system. But what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, for these app deployments, get me the CI IDs. A little later on, we'll look at how to get application information out of the XML document that's in V configuration items. And then we have the assignments, and V application assignments gives us the deployments that we have. So remember, assignment means deployment. One other one that I wanted to include in here was client settings. Client settings join on ID to client setting assignment. So if you need to report on client settings that you have in your environment, start with that as an option. And we'll look at how to drill into some of the lists that are in client settings, because those are XML documents as well. So a couple of rules as well. For applications, software update management, and DCM, everything is a CI. And a CI is an XML document describing a desired state. It might be install this software update from WSUS. It might be check this registry setting for settings management or DCM. Or for applications, it will be a DT and its associated requirement rules. One other confusing thing is when you look at the CIs, you'll notice that the CIs are actually, some of them, there's more CIs than you expect. So take, for example, definition updates in endpoint protection. Those are actually composed of multiple individual updates or binary definition updates. And then there are roll-up definition updates and so on. And they're all clumped together in the WSUS console, so you see one update. And in the config manager, you see one update. But in reality, behind the scenes, there are multiple sub-updates that make up that single definition update. So if a client's out of date, it'll get a bigger update than a up-to-date client will. However, in config manager sees each one of those as a CI. So you'll see lots of individual information there. And then for your reference, here are a couple of common CI types. So deployment types and applications, along with regular updates. The update information should hold true for CM07 as well, but in 2012, obviously, we have no applications or deployment types. Now, was anyone in the Jeopardy session yesterday? Yeah, a couple of people? Cool. One of the questions that got asked was about the VX views. It was one of the double Jeopardy questions. VX views have been in there for a while, and they've been in there to allow Service Manager to extract data from Config Manager. And I thought I'd give a little bit of context around my answer from Jeopardy. So we'll dive into it when we do the demo. But basically, if you're writing a data warehousing solution and you want to use VEX, you can actually use VEX to get changes and do delta updates. So if you have a custom reporting solution that you're building from scratch with its own data warehouse, maybe you're building it on top of OLAP or you're building it on top of another separate database, you can use the VEX views to transfer data in a delta fashion, and I'll show you how to do that. And if you didn't go to that session, you can check out the video for it. So let's jump into a demo and start with something relatively simple. And it's just a straight look at group map. So I wanted just to show you this really quick, because what you can see in group map is that, for example, the power management inventory classes are null. So there are no history classes for those views. However, these are the live views. So if you open up something in Resource Explorer, right? So you go into a machine, right-click, say Start Resource Explorer in the console, and you see all these interesting classes, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. I'm interested in power management, or I'm interested in add-remove programs, or ports. What you'll see here, for example, is ports is VGS port. So these display names are what Resource Explorer sees. This is your current view. This is your history view. And then there's a MIF class as well that teaches inventory processor how to process MIF files. So this is just designed as a simple example of a join. So in this case, I'm starting out with vUpdate info. And I'm saying, give me all the update infos that were revised or posted in the last 31 days. Now, the reason I'm saying revised is sometimes we republish updates. So if you're writing a report, it's actually a good idea to include revised updates as well as posted updates. So when we do our monthly Patch Tuesday release, make sure that you're looking at updates that are posted as well as revised in your compliance reports, because sometimes what some customers will do is they will only look at the currently posted updates. But you also have to make sure that the revised updates are deployed. So anyway, I'm just going in here and I'm doing a date diff to see if it was released in the last 31 days. All right, but more importantly was the join, and you can see there I'm joining on CIID. All right, so that was nice and straightforward. Let's look at something a little bit more interesting, which is content and tracing back a given update. So in this case, I've taken the exact same query that I had before, right? But I've added another join, in fact, two other joins, right here. So I've got these two additional joins here. The first join, which is this one, brings me in content ID. And then the next join brings me in package ID. So now I can return my updates down here and my content source. So I can figure out where the source of the packages are. And then you could take that further and link into package status, determine which distribution points it's being replicated to, and additional information. So you can cascade it along from there. But I just wanted to show you the starting point for that. And then let's look at VEX. So the VEX views are down at the bottom under a different schema. And SCCM_ext is the schema, in case you weren't sure. And then we have this VEX view here. So in this case, this is giving me data export information for device display. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at full collection membership. All right, so the first query is going to pull back all the information that we want. It's going to dump everything. So on the first sync that you would do in a data warehousing solution, grab everything. Okay? So we're going to run that. And you can see it pulls back basically all the collection members. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to order that by row version. And I'm going to order it by row version because row version is actually quite important. Row version is basically like a counter. And it tells us how far we've gotten along extracting data. So if I was to come along and, let's say, extract data to this point, the next time I came along and made a change, the following additional rows would be added. So by doing that, I can actually do a delta synchronization. So I can do a dump of everything. On the next time I come and query the database, I can say, okay, give me everything that has a higher row count than this. And then I get the delta data back. So what that looks like is, I'm going to be a good user, and instead of doing a select star, I'll do just the row version. And that gives me the highest row version currently in the database. So I could save that out in my reporting solution and data warehousing solution to run another query. So in this case, I'm going to take this and say, okay, give me all the row counts that are higher than 0. But I can also come in here and say, okay, let's take a row count like this one and say, okay, give me all the row counts that are higher than that. And you can see I only have one row like that. And the reason it's higher, the reason it's higher is we have, if I can, there we go, square is 5, and I only have one row after that, which is 6. So in effect now, I've got all the changes after that computer was added to that collection membership. Right? So that applies to all those views, and that explains, A, how Service Manager gets data out of Config Manager, but more importantly, if you wanted to build your own custom data warehousing solution, you could do it using the same method. So let's pop back to the slides and talk about something a little bit more interesting. That was just a backup video in case the internet connection went down. XML queries. So I know Kim talked about this in his data collection session, but the XML queries, basically the reason why I'm talking about this is a lot of objects in Config Manager are actually stored now as XML. Specifically, applications are stored as XML. And in SQL Server in recent versions, 2005 and up, I think, SQL has a custom XML data type. And it stores it as a custom XML data type. Now, SQL does allow you to take that entire XML data, turn it into a string, and then parse it as a string. Now, that's a bad idea. It hammers SQL to do that. You're much better off using the built-in XML queries to get your information out. And so we're going to take a look at that. It is complex, especially if you've never queried XML before. I'm not going to, say, oh yeah, it's easy. It will be tricky. There is a hurdle to get the information out. Hopefully the examples that I've shown you, or will show you, make it easier. And then, as I said, casting the entire XML document into a big string is a bad idea. So in terms of demos, let's jump back here. So let's query deployment types. Right, so remember I said that content type ID 21 was deployment types. That's all the deployment types I have in my environment. Now that's not particularly very useful, if I'm honest. Right? To me that means nothing right there. Right, great, I've got some GUIDs. Now if we select the SDM package, you can see it's actually hyperlinked here. So I can go ahead and open it, and oh, that looks better. Right? I've got 7-zip there. So this is my 7-zip package. I can see the location. I can see that it's an MSI file. Right? This is obviously an XML document. Right? And you can see all the settings for the deployment type are in there. Unfortunately, returning that in a report is going to be useless. All right? You're not going to just have a report with a big XML document in one of the fields. You're going to have some annoyed users if you do that. So here's an X query, and before I explain what it does, I'm going to run it. And you can see there that you have SDM package, but now I've got DT title, I've got DT technology, and I've got the content location. So when we break this down, what we've got is, the first thing we do is we say dot value. So this is telling SQL that I want you to open that XML document, and I want to get a particular value out. The first thing I do is I declare a namespace. The namespace can be whatever you want in terms of a name here. But for proper syntax usage, you should make reference to the config manager namespace. But more importantly, this is where it gets interesting, is down here. You can see that we're going first to App Management Digest, deployment type, and then title. So if I come out of that and I go back to that SDM package, you'll see App Digest, deployment type, and title. So I've just described the path to SQL, and I've said go to each of these nodes and grab me the data. Now in this case, I've told it to get me the title, and I've told it to get me the first element. Now in this case, I only have one element, so I'm saying get me the first element, and I'm saying turn it into a varchar. So instead of taking the entire XML document and turning it all into one massive varchar, I'm saying just go out to this one particular node and turn that into a varchar. So what I can then do is I can actually come in here and I can clean that up. In fact, let's drop that as well. And drop the comma. And now I have a list of all my DTs, all the DT technologies that are being used. So is it an AppV package? Is it an MSI package? And the content locations. So that's how you would query a deployment type to get information out. The same logic would apply to applications as well. And you could even, if you wanted to, do it for software updates. Now, software updates, the product already takes that XML data and puts it in a nice table for us. So we don't really need to do that unless we like, creating work for ourselves, which is never something that we do, ever. So a couple of other quick examples of what you can do with. So endpoint protection. Now these queries are actually taken out of our risk assessment program for Config Manager, formerly the RAP. And what this does is it counts or lists the fallback source information. So in this case, you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different sources for this policy. All right? As you can imagine, this is actually stored as an XML document. I'm just going in there and pulling out the fallback source value from a setting. Okay? But the important thing here is I'm doing it nodes and getting back a list of nodes back. Okay, so the nodes query, values give me a particular value. Nodes pull back multiple items. And I'm using this cross-apply statement to actually take something out of the XML document. Because remember, the XML document is a single line in the database. It's all one row. The cross-apply then expands that row into 4 different rows and gives me expands the list, essentially. The last thing that we can do with XML is we can also do a count. So in this case, I'm saying, okay, give me all the policies where we only have a single fallback source, and that fallback source is CM. So in this case, we're looking for any policies where the admin has turned off all fallback sources except for CM. And the reason we do that is because if you configure that in endpoint protection, in case you're wondering why this is in the risk assessment, when you only have a single fallback source listed, when a user goes into endpoint protection and says update definitions, it fails. Because the endpoint protection client expects to have a WSUS or Microsoft Update location. Config Manager can only be used to push definition updates to the endpoint protection client. So we make that as an informational for the customer to be aware of that. So that's an idea of how you can use XML queries to extend your reports. Okay? Let's go back to the presentation. So, what's new in SP1? Well, the most obvious one is that we support SQL Server 2012. Now, the last two bullets are not really that interesting. Power View, however, is interesting. And when we come to the end of the session, I'm going to do a quick demo of some of the stuff that you can do in Excel. And you'll say, okay, Excel, okay, you mean Power Pivot Tables and pivot charts? No. You can actually create full-blown Silverlight dashboards on an ad hoc basis in Excel. And at the end of the session, I'll share a link where I've uploaded the same Excel file that I'm using in the demo. We've also added support for distributed views to get around the replication tax that is imposed by having a CAS. And we'll talk about that slightly. In case you are skeptical about the fact that a replication tax exists in a hierarchy, the best way to test that out is to have a CAS, click Update Collection Membership, and watch what happens. Right? Collection Membership update happens on the primary site, and you've got to wait for it to go down to the primary site, get evaluated, and be sent back up. That's the most obvious way to see the replication tax. Whereas if you do it directly on the primary, it's really, really quick. This one is the most interesting one. We can now run stored procs from within the views. So historically, our guidance has always been use views. Don't touch the stored procs, don't touch the tables. In SP1, we're actually using stored procs and functions quite heavily in the built-in reports. In fact, most of the built-in reports will call at least one, if not more, functions. And the reason that we did that is primarily for RBA. Now, if anyone's looked at this, you'll know that there's a bit of a interesting story about the way that it stands today in SP1. And we'll talk about that. Briefly around distributed views. It's been in there since SQL 2005. It's configured on the replication link between the CAS and the primary site. Okay? Now, in SP1, there are certain catches with using distributed views. First, you can only have one provider. Second, that provider has to sit on the SQL server. And third, that also implies that all of your OSD, ADK, AIK work is going to be done on the provider, which is your SQL server. So, bear that in mind. I wanted to talk about it just so that you understand that it's there. It will mean that your reports show much more live data than if you're allowing replication to happen. Right? Because replication will take 5 minutes to move the data up, especially if you have a lot of activity going on. And if your CAS and your primary site are sat in the same data center, then it makes sense to actually turn on distributed views and allow your CAS and your primary site to stop replicating data and allow the CAS to pull certain data directly from the primary site. Now, we only support it for inventory, software metering, and status messages in SP1. So it's only those particular kinds of site data, not all data. If you're curious about replication, and if some of the terms that I'm using are new to you, I did a session last MMS on DRS, and it is a shameless plug for that session. But if you want more information about how database replication works, if you're considering putting in a hierarchy, you might want to go check out the database replication session and then maybe put in a primary site, right? Hierarchies are designed for very large customers. If you have less than 100,000 clients, look at putting in only a primary site. So currently, DRS replicates site data up from the primary sites to the CAS. When you turn on distributed views, the SMS provider will query the CAS. The CAS will then configure replication to stop replicating hardware inventory, for example. And then the CAS will fire a query back down to the primaries. So what's happening is the CAS is actually firing the T-SQL statement into your primaries. Now, that obviously implies that your primaries have to be very well connected and on a low latency link, because otherwise, it means things like opening Resource Explorer now have to go over the wire from the CAS to the primary. So if you haven't seen it before, very briefly, and I'm not going to turn it on my test environment in the middle of a demo, because that would be... But it's under database replication, CAS primary, link properties, come on, test environment. There we go. And you can see there, distributed views, and then the checkboxes I can hit to turn on distributed views. So again, the idea here, if you have an environment where your primary sites and your CAS are sat in the same data center, this is an option to stop moving data around between two servers sat next to each other in the data center. Okay? And it will mean that your reports can actually get data from the primary site much quicker because the data is not actually on the CAS is querying the primary site. Well, that's where you turn it on. All right, so in the past, we've always hit v_databases, or views in the database. In SP1, the built-in reports are now all calling RBA functions. The catch is that today, most of those RBA functions don't actually do anything. The reason I'm talking about it is because if you go into the SSRS reports right now, you crack them open in your environment, you will not see views. You will see RBA functions being called. Today, they are pretty much transparent. The question was, the RBA functions, what are they doing then? And today, they are transparent. And I'll take a look at, in the demo, I'll show you what they do. They're basically doing a select star from a view. Okay? Let me get the phrasing correctly. We are investigating enabling RBA for reports. Okay? In SP1, we didn't enable it because as part of our testing, we noticed that there is a performance hit when a user is a member of a lot of groups. We have to resolve all of those groups and determine their RBA membership inside of the report rendering phase, which is quite expensive. So we made the decision, instead of introducing pain to customers, we would actually just take those RBA functions out, essentially, without changing all the reports. So SSRS loads the RDL report. The RDL queries SQL to populate the report parameters. All right, that's just a SQL query. That query fires an RBA function. And then in SP1, the RBA function just gives it everything. All right, so it does nothing. But if we jump back in here, here's a report that I have. All right, just a standard random report, right? It's compliance 1, overall compliance. Out of the box, I haven't done anything to it. If you go in there and look at the query, and we expand it out, you will see, there we go, there's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. So we're calling 3 functions. There are no views there. So if I was an admin, and I do what I typically do, and a customer comes to me and says, or a business user comes to me and says, hey, I need a report like this. Right? Typically what I would do is say, okay, the closest report is this one. I'd crack open that report and begin to modify it to add the data that they wanted. Well, now if I go in there, I just see a bunch of functions. Luckily, the functions have fairly obvious names, and what you can do, in fact, is just strip off this piece and stick a v underscore in there. But since this is MMS and we're a bit geeky, what I'm actually going to do in the demo is go into the function, pick one of these random RBA functions, right? And you'll see that we have them. We have one RBA function per view. So we'll take the collection view. I'm going to modify it. Ignore that message. All right? And in that case, we're returning information back, and it's basically select star. If you go in here and look at the hardware inventory history views, come on. You'll see we're pulling back similar information. But in essence, the RBA functions, you can think of them as no-ops, and they're returning all the data back. Okay? But the point in showing you that was so that when you go into those reports yourselves and you see those RBA functions, you're not like, what the hell is that? You can actually go in there and figure out that they are views being fired today. If you're building your own custom reports, consider using the RBA functions. Because what that means is that your RBA functions, when we turn on RBA support, will automatically have that capability. If, however, you want to make sure that your reports always return the same data unless you initiate the change, then obviously use the views, and that gets you more control. Okay? Report security in SP1. So one other question that came up from my customers is they looked at RBA, and you guys have seen the run report and modify report. Yeah? Those, basically the way that is implemented is those will control which reports a user can run. Fair enough. However, we control that at the SSRS level. Because we control that at the SSRS level, not the config manager level, not at the provider level, right? We have an external process in the reporting service point thread that will every 10 minutes read the RBA permissions, go out and configure SSRS for us. So very briefly, what that looks like is when you go into the console, back to my console, and we go to administration, security, administrative users, and you'll see I was messing around earlier with run as. That's better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grant myself permissions. So I'm going to go in there. And I'm going to go to assigned roles and grant myself the read-only analyst role because I don't actually trust myself. It's a deep-seated issue. I don't like talking about it, but if I go in there and I say read-only analyst, the read-only analyst has run reports against all the reports. Now, if I go into monitoring, right, as you would, you'd go into the reports, and we let the report node fire off. Okay, pick any folder. You go in there and go to properties, security, and my user account isn't in there, which means I don't have permissions yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to force the reporting services point to update itself. And what you'll see here is I've just kicked it off again. And you can see it's gone in there and it's starting to say, hey, things are out of sync. And now, when we go back in there and look at properties, if I close that dialog and open it again, you'll see that I now have permissions. So by default, in the interest of the demo and speeding things up, I force that to happen immediately. In your environment, it will take 10 minutes if you use that. Now, a couple of things to note with that is that if you go into SSRS and start messing around with the permissions on the default folders, every 10 minutes, the reporting service point will come along and say, those are wrong. I'll fix them. And it fixes them. So, if you're okay using RBA, right? So you're familiar with RBA, you're happy to use RBA, you're okay granting everyone read access to a particular folder, you have no need for granular permissions. So you say software updates, right? If you have permissions to software updates, you have permissions to all the reports. Then you can use the RBA permissions. You can use SSRS permissions if you want to create your own folders. So you could have your own Contoso folder, and underneath that you have all the reports, and you ACL them yourself from SSRS or from the Config Manager console in a custom folder. The last option is a hybrid option where you have the RBA folders, all right, the built-in folders. You grant permissions to those built-in folders, and then you create your own custom folder in addition to that, and in there you use your granular reports. So if you say this is a sensitive report that reports on inappropriate applications on a user's machine, you can ACL that in a custom folder however you want to specific users. Okay? Now, last but not least, other options for reporting. So far, I've only jumped into SSRS once. The reason is that there are a lot of other reporting options outside of SSRS. Yes, it's the one that's built into the console. Yes, it has the built-in reports. But nothing stops you from taking a data set out of SSRS and plugging it as a T-SQL query wherever you want. Okay? It could be the SharePoint dashboarding solution, if you have SharePoint. It could be that you choose to deploy Service Manager because you're licensed for Service Manager and you just want to use Service Manager purely as a data warehousing and reporting solution. That's another option. My personal favorite is to use Power Pivot and Power View in Excel 2013. Now, if you haven't heard about Power Pivot, or you've only looked at it a while ago, one cool thing about Power Pivot is the SQL team has now taken it on as a full-blown solution. Okay? You can actually take an Excel file that you've created in Power Pivot, take it to 2012 Analysis Services, and restore it as a database into Analysis Services. And it strips out the XML in the Excel file and grabs the Power Pivot database on the inside and mounts it as a database in Analysis Services. And what that means is that you as an admin can actually do all your messing about in Excel however you want, stay the hell away from SQL data tools, right, because they scare me. And eventually take it to your SQL DBAs and say, hey, I've done all the work. I have your BI semantic model, but it's in Excel. And I can say, okay, take that, mount it into Analysis Services, and they have full-blown reports. Power View then sits on top of Power Pivot, and it allows you to have presentation-ready reports that you create on an ad hoc basis. And when I say presentation-ready, I mean purdy. They'll be very, very purdy. So let's take a look at that in my lab. And I am trying to finish up 15 minutes early so that you guys can get to the party and beat the taxi line. So if you wouldn't mind, I would be eternally grateful if you reflected that in the surveys. Not that I'm trying to bribe you or anything, because that would be wrong. So here is an Excel demo that I loaded up. This demo is based on MSIT's own dashboarding solution. So the queries are actually MSIT's own queries for some of their reports. The data is my own test data, as you can see, but the queries are MSIT's data. So this is Excel 2013. You do need to have Office 2013 Professional Plus to get this, but if you go into Options and Add-ins, so there's a question, does 32-bit or 64-bit matter? The way that Power Pivot works is, and Analysis Services in 2012 when in tabular mode, is it's not a relational database. It doesn't store information on a row-by-row basis. It stores it on a column basis. So think about operating system description in your config manager database, right? That has row by row by row, and maybe, let's say, you've got 25% Windows XP, 70% Win 7, and the rest are Win 8. And you have 10,000 rows of information like that. What this new model does is it says, I will look at that column. There's only 3 unique entries. So I'll store the 3 unique entries, and everything else will be a pointer back to that data. What that means is the SQL team see a 10-to-1 compression ratio on customer databases. Okay, great. You've compressed the data, so what? The point is now that the data is compressed, you could take a 500 gig database, make it 50 gig. Now that it's 50 gig, you can load the entire thing up in memory. Not cache into memory like SQL does, the database, or Analysis Services does for OLAP, but actually load the entire database into memory when you start up. And what that means is you have a 1,000-to-1 performance improvement. Now, the reason I went through all that is that if you have 32-bit Excel, that means that your address space is limited to 2 gig. So approximately, you could load a 20 gig database into a 2 gig file and potentially get it up into memory. If you had 64-bit Excel, you could obviously get a lot more information in there. But going back to that whole do it in Excel and take it to analysis services, you could filter your reports or start at a smaller primary site and then go up to your CAS when you go to analysis services if you had a massive environment. So to turn this on, go into your COM add-ins, because COM is cool. And you'll see 2 checkboxes in there. They're off by default. Just turn them on and hit OK. And then you'll get this new Power Pivot node. If you go in there and hit Manage, it will load Power Pivot at that point. And the whole point of Power Pivot is to take data out, and yes, you do get those performance enhancements, but to take data out of any database, it doesn't even have to be Config Manager, it could be any database that you want, Ops Manager, a non-System Center product if you wanted, and you can build what the SQL team call a BI semantic model. Don't worry about what that means. It's a very fancy term, but essentially, it's taking ugly view names and joins and T-SQL queries and turning them into pretty friendly names that anyone could use. So it's taking data and turning it into information. Okay, and what I mean by that is these tabs down here are table names. But initially, they were V underscore something random. You couldn't give that to a business analyst or an IT analyst and say, hey, build the report that you want from this solution. Or even one of your junior admins. You couldn't, because they would need to understand what V underscore something means. In this case, yeah, patch deployment details, I know what that means. Available, I know what that means. Deployment name, that makes sense. Last deployment state for enforcement, that makes a whole lot more sense than a default column name. So that's all in there. I'm going to show you how to change the connection because I've uploaded this Excel file and I'll share the link for you at the end. But if you go into Edit and Advanced, Advanced. Because if you might be tempted to hit the server name drop-down list. Don't do that because it will try and query my SQL 04 database in your environment and not find it, and you'll time out, and it'll take a while. Instead, go to Advanced, and then you've just got a text field here, and you can just type in whatever your, my server name, whatever your server name is, and hit OK. Or test the connection if you're unsure of what you've typed. So I've built this up. You can build relations between it. One thing that we did for MSIT as a proof of concept was we actually, how many of you need to reference information in your own environments? So in MSIT's case, the simple was site codes. Their site codes don't mean anything to business users, right? RD1 doesn't mean anything. But if you say that that is the Americas primary site 1, or the Americas site 1, that makes more sense. And yes, you could have had it in the site description field, and you could have done something there. But let's say you didn't think about it when you're installing it at 8 o'clock at night and you forgot. You need some sort of business reference. Power Pivot actually lets you go out to a SharePoint list and dump a SharePoint list as an XML feed and make reference to it in your T-SQL statements. What that means is you could actually build a report where you say, oh yeah, this is coming off of SharePoint. Go into this SharePoint list and modify it however you want. And the external data source for that is OData feed. So if you go into SharePoint, every SharePoint list is exposed as an OData feed. You can just go select OData feed, give it the URL that SharePoint gives you, and now you've got a nice user-editable list. Instead of you having to go and tweak your T-SQL every time business decides that, no, that's not an appropriate name because that division shut down, or We've moved those machines, that subnet ID no longer matches. You can go in there and change it. Once you have that in place, you've got a nice view down here that gives you all the columns that you had in there. So you've got all the columns and all the tables. You can go in there, go to Insert, and say Power View. And Excel will do some of its magic. By default, it creates this pivot table that allows you to select icons in there. If you give it to an IT analyst or a business analyst, they can have fun with pivot tables all they want. The key is that you're building that model that says, these ugly views are these friendly names. As my lab's disks churn. You can see that looks like Silverlight, and that's because it's actually hosting Silverlight in there. So what I can do is I can go in there and take operating system count details, and I can say operating system, and then config manager client count. And you'll see that there's a nice little table. Not very exciting, if I'm honest, as it refreshes the data. Right? Yeah, great. It's really boring. The key is you can come in here, you can say, give me a clustered bar off of that data. You immediately have a clustered bar. You can do filtering live from in here, and you could switch it to a pie chart. As you do the filtering, so just zoom in there. Let's do a live zoom in. Operating system, and I can say only show me my data center servers. It dynamically switches it. I come out of. It's dynamically switched it. So I can turn it all on, switches it up. The idea is that this is something that's presentation ready. And it's pulling data live. There's a map option in there. The other interesting one is the scatter chart. Now in this case, in the interest of time, I'm just going to point it out. There is a play axis. So if you have dates in your config manager database, you can actually tie the play access to those dates, and it will actually put a little play button down here. You'll be able to hit play, and it will animate your patch stats over time in a scatter chart. So there's a whole lot of really cool things that you can do with PowerView. The SQL team has tons of stuff on PowerView and the different ways of presenting data and how you can present it. It's just an idea of showing you other options with which to do reporting. So, we're just at the end. All the queries and the demos are posted up to our UK team blog. It's got the session code in there, so if you go in there, you can get all the T-SQL queries. And that Excel file that I just showed you, I've uploaded that as well. So you can grab that, connect it to your own environment, have a play, see what the data looks like. Just change the server name, hit refresh. It'll pull your data into PowerPivot, and you can have a play with PowerPivot. Please fill out your evals. My value as a human being is defined by what you put in those evals, so please be gentle. Q&A. If you would go up to the mics if you have any questions. If you're going to ask me when the SQL View documentation is available, I went to the documentation team and got this statement for you. And with that, I will give you 10 minutes back to go and rush and grab a taxi over to the Wynn or the Encore to the party. Thank you for your time.